Hello and welcome to this video poking fun at one of the cartoon characters from years ago and the rather ironic lessons we can draw from them. Let's use the single character of Nigel Thornberry and ask if he really is a human. Before getting any further, we do have to wonder if this will fall foul of YouTube's vague rules on harassment and bullying. But then again, it is nearly a 70-year-old cartoon character. So who knows what the magic 8-ball, better known as YouTube, will decide. Rather than go metaphysical and ask what is human, let's instead ask what defines a species. Generally, you could say that a species is defined by its similarity to others of its kind and ability to reproduce with viable or fertile offspring. This is largely a morphological species definition. Consider how a horse and donkey are similar, but they produce sterile offspring known as a mule. When we say similarity, we mean appearance, behavior, diet, and a few other elements that we'll get into. There are other schools of thought that define a species by its genetics, the degree and time in which a species differentiated from another, or its most recent common ancestor. The ecological similarities, and a uniquely applied evolutionary significant unit. For this video, given our lack of information, we can really only rely on the morphology and sexual reproduction to define a species. Let's begin with the origin of Nigel Thornberry. He is supposedly some sort of aristocrat, being Sir Nigel Thornberry. That automatically excludes him from the ranks of us filthy peasants in the wider proletariat. Ignoring his aristocratic trappings, he was born in 1951. When the TV show The Wild Thornberrys aired, he would have been in his late 40s. By now, he would be 69. He is supposedly of an education level where he would be a professor at Oxford. He has a ginger red hair, which made us immediately suspicious. He has a wife and at least 2 biological children and 1 adopted child. None of the children have acquired his extremely brightly coloured hair, but if he was human, this might make sense. From this, we can establish a degree of sexual reproduction, and we can study his morphological and physiological traits. Let's start with the more obvious of the two. What would Nigel Thornberry look like as a skeleton? Assuming his skeleton is structured like that of a human, he must have some truly bizarre structures in mind. This comes from his long neck, like what is seen in tribal modifications. Incredibly large nose, tiny eyes, long ears, and teeth at the top. His legs are strangely distorted. His abdomen and thorax take up a disproportionate amount of space. This is bizarre and not compatible with what we see here in a normal human skeleton. There is an established body of research, both on the average size of various body parts and how they relate to each other as a ratio or percentage. The femur to height ratio is approximately a 1:4. This is the information needed for things like a coronial service where dead bodies are investigated. If you only have a skeleton, or worse yet an incomplete skeleton, these ratios are needed to estimate the living body measurements. We can apply something similar here by taking one measure, his fingers, and using them as a basic reference point for everything else. In tribal cultures, the process of neck stretching has visually a simple effect. It makes the neck appear longer. In fact, it depresses the collarbone and causes other harm. This leads to the weakening of neck muscles that hold the neck upright. In his case, we can calculate the neck that has a diameter of roughly 8 centimeters and a height of nearly 38 centimeters. This compares non-favorably with the average adult neck, which has an average diameter of 38 centimeters and a height of between 35 and 48. This means it's as high as a normal neck, but substantially narrower. This would give a good indication that it should be weak and unable to support its own weight. Signs of, if not a different species, at least pathologies. His nose is another consideration. Look at this skull of an average human. There is a big hole in the middle. It is creatively known as the nasal cavity. Such a stunning and brave name with so much creativity put into it. They must have thought, let's call this hole for the nose a cavity, and to be sure, let's call it the nasal cavity. What we find important here is the role and place of the nasal cavity. It provides space for the nose to act as a filter, both to temperature and moisture. Foreign particles are a close second to these. Given this, it must be of an appropriately corresponding size to allow for relatively uninterrupted airflow. In an average human, this is up to 3 square centimeters. We've taken his nose and we've calculated that it is roughly a triangle of 22 by 22 centimeters. This gives a cross-section of 17.1 square centimeters at the back. This means that the nasal cavity itself would be slightly smaller, at closer to 15 centimeters, 5 times the size of a normal human. This is substantially too large. Now for his eyes, and we do wonder how he can see, or at least that seems to be the way if you look at it in relation to everything else. His eyes are roughly 35 to 40 millimeters in size. The average eye itself for a male is between 21 and 27 millimeters, with a range of between 20 and 28 in some studies. His eyes are therefore roughly 25% larger than the average human, and, considering everything else, we can simply put this down to variation, let's say. While that might be an anomaly, his ears are a curious example. The average human ear is 6.3 centimeters long. By our approximation, the ears of Nigel Thornberry are nearly 150 millimeters, or 15 centimeters. Where his eyes are roughly 25% larger, his ears are more than 130% larger than the norm. Then there are his teeth. The average human's central teeth are roughly 11 to 12 millimeters. The visible section of Nigel Thornberry's teeth, by our rough approximation, is 50 to 60 millimeters. In size, that is 5 to 6 times the size of the whole human tooth on average, let alone the portion not visible. This compares favorably with what a rabbit or a mouse might have, where their teeth continue to grow unless they are worn down. We do not believe, though, that he is either of these animals, therefore his tooth development is an interesting exception to the otherwise slightly large and exaggerated features. There are so many strange and bizarre abnormalities with him. These are his visible features that we can measure with a proxy tool. But what of his skeleton? This is where things get more than a little disconcerting. Think the homunculi from most classes on psychology. The normal human skeleton is well known. If we can transfer the basic design of this to the body of Nigel Thornberry, we get this bizarre creation. It clearly does not line up properly. We can begin by adjusting the axial skeleton. This is the head, spine, and rib bones. Still, something is clearly not right. His rib cage needs to be expanded, and the spine must be compacted in the thoracic and abdominal regions, but extended in the cervical region. This is complemented by the ribs, which are where the shoulders connect, and we need to look at this to understand how the arms can fit into this odd little body. Now we need to attach the hip bones and limbs. Starting with the arms, they need to attach to the torso. How can we fit the arms to the torso with it being so far from where they are shown to be? The human shoulder joint is a juncture of many bones that provide less structural strength. In exchange for this, the body gains 3 planes of movement with 180 degrees of movement range. This means that we are looking at how the shoulder joint could exist here, how we see it. You need to move these bones in odd ways, change their size and possibly their structure slightly. There's more issues here than just how do we fit the basic design and then manipulate it to match this. We see a similar issue that occurs with the legs. How do we fit the legs as they are shown to the normal human skeleton? Unlike the normal human skeleton, the legs must come back in toward the center line. This allows them to line up with how we see them in this image. Note that the femurs must come back in, that the hips must be wide and somewhat displaced. Now for reproduction. We can be reasonably certain that Marianne is human, and according to the show, she definitely seems human. We have no reason to question that, and this makes us believe that the standard rules of inheritance apply. That would fit into the different phenotypes we see in the children. You have Elizabeth and Deborah. The most distinguishing feature of the two is their hair. One has an almost red-colored hair, while the other is blonde. In humans, the gene for red hair is recessive, and so not expressing this gene would make sense. This explains why the older child is blonde. That only the one child, the younger, has somewhat red hair might indicate a pair of recessive genes were somehow inherited, and therefore the phenotype is coming through to some extent. The point to take away is that it seems the genes from Nigel Thornberry can be passed on successfully. This is the first requirement to be human in terms of sexual reproduction. The question is, are they viable offspring? Ultimately, we can conclude he could be a human, but one that has a serious underlying pathology, and we are not talking about his red hair, but instead some sort of growth aberration, and most likely a developmental aberration. The nature of his bone structure and the way he's been deformed would indicate there are some serious problems with how he has grown and developed. It's that, or he's in fact not a human. What we hope you can take away from this is not necessarily the flaws in the design of this character, but the somewhat ironic lesson of how the morphology of any given creature can give you a strong idea of how closely related it is to another creature. Are they from the same species at a minimum? Or are they adapting to different environments and diverging? Or are they converging in evolutionary terms by adapting to the same environment but coming from different progenitors? If you have come this far through the video, then we strongly suggest you look at a recent topic in anthropology. This is known as Homo floresiensis, or the hobbits of Indonesia. They have been presented as a challenge to anthropology, particularly in identifying both the species and where the line is drawn between them. It's a relatively old species in terms of our own modern history, but in evolutionary terms it is very young, and likely split off from our most recent ancestor not that long ago. What we've been struggling with is, are they a pathological species that is tiny because of disease? Are they intentionally tiny and have remained so because it gave them some sort of advantage and more? Much like we drew comparisons with Nigel Thornberry, anthropologists have been trying to study this species and understand what is going on. Thank you for watching this video. If you have found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions below.